Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this, the fifth in a series of 5 webinars after Strangeways. My name is Charlie Weinberg. I am the chair of the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies, and it's my pleasure to open and close this final event today. Over this week, a range of speakers have brought to life the history, conditions, meaning and impact of what's often referred to as the Strangeways riot of 1990. We've heard about the political context and environment from Rex Bloomstein, Eamon Carabine and Elaine Player. The personal, community and family impacts from Eric Allison, Diane Curry, Stephen Akpabio Klementowski, John Crilly, and we've heard again about the resonance with today's circumstances, so movingly and eloquently, if not consistently shockingly, from Katuma Sinsadsen, Patrick Williams, Caroline Willow, Gloria Morrison, Steve Toombs, Kate Paradine, Alan White and David Scott. If women, race and class were ever a phrase worthy of consideration, now is that time. Today, in the light and strength of all that information and experience, we look ahead. Can we do better, differently? Can we do without prison? Or as the organisation I work for, Safeground, asks, can we do without punishment? I'm going to ask our 5 eminent speakers to each present for 10 minutes, and we will do our best to integrate your questions and comments as we go along. Please use the Q&A function you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and please do promote other people's questions and comments as you see them, because they will get promoted. I just want to let you know that yesterday, out of the roughly 40 questions and comments that were posted, approximately 5 got actually asked. So bear with us, we are going to do our very best. Please use the hashtag #AfterStrangeways when you tweet, and please do fill in your follow-up email when you get it. We genuinely really do care about your feedback. Our 5 speakers today, in reverse order, are Jo Sim, co-organiser of this series of events and long-standing friend and colleague of the Centre, Professor of Criminology at Liverpool John Moores University, a leading author in the field of prison and punishment. Eric Allison, prisons correspondent for The Guardian, co-author with Nikki Jameson of Strangeways 1990, and Eric was also a prisoner in Strangeways for more than 4 years during the 60s and 70s. Mary Corcoran, reader in criminology and director of programmes in criminology at Keele University. Mary is a leading author and researcher into prisons, women in the criminal justice system and voluntary sector organisations working in relation to criminal justice. David Scott is senior lecturer at the Open University and author of various books, including Against Imprisonment and most recently, the International Handbook of Penal Abolition. But to start us off today, bringing a perspective we haven't heard so far during the week, is Andrea Albert, President of the Prison Governors Association. So Andrea, if you're ready, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to speak at this webinar. As you would expect, I looked at the summary of the main findings and recommendations of the Wolf Report and was struck by how many of the main recommendations had not been implemented, how many of the issues facing the prison service 30 years ago feature today in our prisons, and how we never seem to learn from the past. Having spent 30 years in the prison service and governed 4 prisons, it seems like we have been in constant reform but have never actually fundamentally reformed. We still lock up too many people, often in not fit for purpose accommodation, delivering regimes for the masses in an atmosphere which is unsafe. Ultimately, if the main purpose of prisons is to protect the public, rehabilitate, support reducing reoffending, and help resettle offenders back into the community, we don't exactly excel at it. So for the next few minutes, I'm not going to talk about some emotional, philosophical pie-in-the-sky future for perfect prisons. I just want to talk about real life and what could make a difference for people living and working in them. When austerity hit the public sector last decade, we saw approximately 25% reduction in prison budgets. We reduced our staffing by thousands of prison officers, administrators and other grades. Unfortunately, we did not see a 25% reduction in the prison population, nor did we try and reduce what we did with prisoners by 25%. Somehow it was expected that these massive cuts, that we would be able to do the same things in a more efficient way. It was a disaster. The performance of prisons deteriorated, safety statistics hit record highs, self-inflicted deaths, self-harming and violence across the board were out of control. What was asked was undeliverable. So for me, the first thing we need to do is ask government, what is the purpose of prisons and how much money are you prepared to spend on prisons? These are fundamental questions, the answers to which will dictate what we do in our prisons. I don't think we can be philosophical in the answers. These are business questions which require honest answers. The government pledge to increase police officers by 20,000 fills me with dread. It will increase the prison population, and unless we improve the prison experience for offenders, we will continue to do more of the same and achieve the same poor outcomes. Secondly, regardless of budgets, we require people to work in our prisons. During austerity, the pay and reward package for prison officers was substantially reduced, whilst the working environment became hostile and dangerous. We have suffered ever since with a high attrition rate. We struggle to keep our prison officers, particularly in the first 2 years. We only offer a 10-week training course and then it's sink or swim on the landings. The Prison Service Peer Review Body recommended in its last report a substantial pay lift for prison officers to help with recruitment and retention and also bring them in line with other sectors. The government refused to accept this recommendation. In such a difficult, challenging environment, we should be recruiting the best people who have the skills, attributes and intelligence to make a difference. So my second point would be, make joining the prison service very attractive to the very best, because we don't want just average. Give them a competitive pay and reward package, along with professionalisation of the role and a clear defined career path. If budgets are tight, it is even more important that we recruit the best and keep them so that this limited resource has the greatest impact. Thirdly, we must make our prisons a safer environment to live and work in. The quarterly safety statistics have been horrific for a number of years, and despite massive strategic focus, additional resource, also it's enough we've not been able to crack. These stats measure self-inflicted deaths, self-harm, prisoner-on-staff assaults and prisoner-on-prisoner assaults. And whilst we may have made some tentative improvements, the progress does not match the level of investment, both in time and resource. However, we have an opportunity in front of us. The lockdown regime due to COVID has been incredibly challenging for prisoners, but there has been learning from it, which has tested some of our long-held beliefs, which has driven policy previously. We have built regimes for the masses, lots of people unlocked together for long periods of time, doing lots of activities together. This is a scary policy for prisoners. They feel unsafe. When people feel unsafe, they only have the headspace to survive, not engage. COVID has delivered a different type of regime in order to reduce the risk of transmission of the virus. Small family groups coming out together for shorter periods of time has felt less pressured for prisoners and safer and more comfortable for them. Now, it's fair to say that 23 hours lockup, as it is now, is not desirable for health and well-being. But if we can look at a regime that follows this kind of principle, I do believe we will improve safety. And if we improve safety, then both staff and prisoners will be more likely to build those trusting relationships which really do support a rehabilitative environment. A safer environment will also support staff retention. We have an attrition rate of around 11%, even higher in staff with less than 2 years. My fourth point is physical environment. Many of our prisons are Victorian and dilapidated and absolutely not fit for purpose in a modern service. Unfortunately, some of our new prisons were built in the 1980s, 40 years ago, and also require significant maintenance investment too. The PG understand that maintenance of the estate requires £500 million every year for a decade just to stand still, let alone modernise to the level needed. This year, the government has committed just over 300 million, woefully inadequate. Despite COVID reducing our population by 6,000 to 78,000, we are still an overcrowded service, with many prisons still placing 2 people in a cell built for 1 with a toilet and a sink in a tiny space. Government's announcement of 18,000 new prison places is brilliant, but this is not new for all. There is no intention of closing any current accommodation. These places are there for the projected increase in population on the back of the 20,000 extra police officers. So whilst I accept that safety and good staff-prisoner relationships are key to success of prisons, a physical environment is also pivotal in promoting rehabilitation and fostering a culture that prisons feel invested in and not forgotten by society. My final point is the size of the prison population. The government has invested in reducing reoffending and have various initiatives which, if the judiciary have confidence in them, will divert people from custody. There will be better supervision of offenders on release and on community orders. That said, these initiatives are not proven yet. What we do know is that changes to sentencing and changes to early releases mean we will have more offenders in custody serving longer. We do know that 20,000 extra police officers will mean more people in prison. We do know that we have never built our way out of overcrowding and new prisons will be filled. We do know that what we do in prisons is not reducing reoffending as we would want. The UK locks up more people than any other European country and it's not working. The prison population must be reduced. So in summary, this is for me getting the basics right, and it's more important than anything else. Once we achieve that, then I firmly believe true reform can take place in whatever guise it comes. So define the purpose of prisons and fund appropriately, attract and retain a workforce of dedicated professionals who want to make a difference, deliver an environment and a regime in which people feel safe, both staff and prisoners, have a prison estate which is maintained and fit for purpose in a modern society, and finally, reduce the prison population and concentrate on being a successful part of the whole reduced and reoffending agenda. Thank you.
Andrea, thank you so much. I wonder how many people in the audience might be slightly surprised to hear how much you've actually got in common with some of the more radical ideas presented across the week. You're the chair of the Prison Governors Association, and you're talking potentially about quite radical changes to the structures. And before we went live, we were talking about sometimes it takes a while for the audience to warm up and for questions to come in. There's a heap of questions, all with your name on them. So I won't get to them all now, but there's a couple of things that I think kind of connect. One is about fast-track graduate schemes and what your opinion on those are and how they may or may not work efficiently. And the other, which I think relates, is about prison officer culture. That's been a bit of a theme emerging through the seminar series, and where you think we are with that, particularly in the context of the conditions that led up to the protest.
If I can start with the second question first, please. You know, I've covered 4 prisons. I've been in the prison service for 30 years, and there are some absolutely outstanding prison officers. In fact, the vast majority are absolutely outstanding. I think over the last 30 years, culturally, things have changed. We were quite a militaristic service, certainly around the Strangeways time, but we now seem to attract sort of younger people who've come straight from doing their A-levels or from university and have a completely different outlook on life. So culturally, I think the last decade during austerity, we've had some really difficult problems with staff-prisoner relationships because the environment has been so incredibly hostile on both sides. People living and working in prisons have been very scared, and that doesn't foster a good culture on either side. So in what I've just spoken about, if we can make our prisons safer, if there is headspace and time for staff and prisoners to build a relationship, a trusting relationship, then I think culturally, you know, we will get back to where we were. And I do believe in sort of the 2000s, probably 2000 to 2010, we were generally a well-resourced service. Our safety statistics were significantly better than they are now. We had a lot of stability, and we did have generally good staff-prison relationships. So yes, like in any role, there will be a few bad eggs, but my personal view is that most prison officers are fantastic, and the environment that they have had to work in over the last decade has been so difficult. The environment that prisons had to live in the last decade and continue to live in has been really difficult. And if we can kind of crack that, then I think culturally we will get back to where we were and actually even improve on that. The first question around the graduate scheme, I think the graduate scheme's brilliant. It doesn't bring enough people in. It's quite small, quite tight. That might be deliberate. But I think any fast track scheme, or any scheme really, that brings in new ideas, new thinking into our service is always a good thing. So yeah, I and the Prison Governors Association are absolute advocates of fast track graduate schemes, and they bring something very special to our service. But then I have to say, I think everybody who wants to work in the prison service brings something very special.
Andrea, thank you so much. And I'm really hoping that we'll get time to come back to the now 11 questions and comments that are directed just as a result of your intervention so far. Thank you so much. Barsha, I just want to point to your comment and question. Andrea, you go, and I'm going to bring David in. But before I do that, I just want to say there's a question that's been asked about how, if policy is made that seems to fly in the face of nearly all the evidence and experience and information around, what do career entrants and students and the new energy that Andrea's describing, how are we supposed to make change or not get disparaged? And I'd ask all our panelists and all our audience members to bear that in mind. I think that's a question that goes to the very heart of today. David, if you're ready, your turn. Give us 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to start this talk with a well-known quotation from the Irish anti-slavery abolitionist Daniel O'Connell, who famously wrote, "Nothing is politically right which is morally wrong." These sentiments perhaps sum up my approach to imprisonment and the importance of framing the critique of prisons as they are currently constituted within the context of a profound moral failure of legitimacy. My work on prisons as an activist scholar stretches across some 25 years, and perhaps the main leitmotif running through all my work is the notion that prisons and punishment are simply morally wrong, that prisons cannot be morally defended. This moral critique results in a subsequent political challenge to the rightness of prisons and the kind of societies that sustain them in their current form and function. I would like to discuss today some of the basic premises of this moral critique and why this has led me to conclude that the only morally and politically acceptable way forward is the abolition of prisons. This call for abolition should not be made through a gentle whisper, but rather as a bold, loud, and unequivocal proclamation. We have heard much in the previous webinars about class-based, racialized, and gendered injustice, and the wider political context of the prison as an institution which almost exclusively punishes the poor, be it prisoners or indirectly their families. These arguments, made so well by numerous contributors in the last 5 days, regarding the impoverished social backgrounds of prisoners, their profound vulnerabilities, and the way in which criminalisation and penalisation reflect existing hierarchies of power, are absolutely necessary in terms of shining a spotlight on both penal and social injustice and the struggles against such injustices. My concern is with the profound moral deficit that lies at the heart of our society and the ongoing humanitarian disaster of penal confinement. When referring to morality, what I mean is the sense of obligation for the well-being of others. In other words, morality is about the responsibility to care for, show empathy and compassion, and provide material, emotional, and psychological support for the people around us. Ultimately, this means aiming to meet human need, sustain life, and to treat all people, whatever their status or background, like the fellow human beings that they are. Here, I just want to focus on three aspects of morality that are central to the call for penal abolition. The first aspect is the systemic neutralizing of morality in the prison place. Prisons are institutions which are much more likely to foster the denial of moral obligations than to lead to their acknowledgement. We have heard many times this week of the problems generated by an authoritarian prison officer occupational culture. Yet, as well as the harms and violence dished out through their invisible brutal hands, there are also many other examples of prison officers dealing with prisoners with a sense of distance, of neglect, or moral indifference. While some prison officers undoubtedly undertake very important and sometimes life-saving work, the prison context is overwhelmingly one of deprivation and suffering that presents an existential threat to life. Morality drowns in a place where pale corpses, newly arisen, groan for pain and weep for cold, as Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote in The Mask of Anarchy in 1819 when referring to the prison. Prisons are a sea of suffering where hour by hour, day by day, week by week, any sense of obligation for other people's well-being is overwhelmed. Yes, small islands of intimacy, care, and compassion may sometimes exist, but the sufferings created through the pains of imprisonment are relentless and structured within its daily workings. If morality is about meeting our obligations to others, prisons cannot be moral institutions. But discussion of immorality should not just be restricted to what happens inside the prison walls. Placing imprisonment within the wider context of social harms and social and economic inequalities is a hallmark of penal abolitionism. Indeed, such consideration leads us to reflect on our second aspect of morality, which is termed here as the highest form of immorality, the failure of moral responsibility or obligation for the life and well-being of others on the part of those with the greatest wealth and power in society, notably those institutions of capitalism and the state corporate complex. Charles Wright Mills, in his brilliant The Power Elite, wrote in the 1950s about the growth of a systemic higher immorality, which he defined as the general weakening of older values and the organization of irresponsibility. The higher immorality for Mills was met by a creeping indifference and a silent hollowing out, and attempts at the mystification of the immorality of the powerful continue to this day, one of which is to ensure that focus remains squarely on the soiled moral status of those imprisoned. When thinking about morality and imprisonment, it is therefore essential to look at the moral obligations and responsibilities of those who hold the most power, both in terms of the largely hidden harms they perpetrate, such as health and safety breaches and avoidable and premature deaths, like Steve Toombs talked about yesterday, and the failings of those in political power to create a society which genuinely meets and sustains life for all. Perhaps the highest form of morality is then the building of a society that can meet needs for all, rather than one that relies on prisons to soak up the unwanted people that nobody feels like they are morally obliged to help anymore. This brings us to our third aspect of morality: moral leadership. The previous discussion hints at interconnections between morality and politics and the importance of an ethico-political intervention. For Antonio Gramsci, the task of activist scholars is to provide moral leadership, by which he means engaging with and inspiring ordinary people to work together and generate a new collective ethics that genuinely reflects their universal interests. In other words, creating a new form of hegemony that stands in opposition to that of the power elite and their construction of morality. Too much of the political debate today is trapped within the alleged morality of the law and order society. Moral leadership for penal abolitionism therefore means challenging the moral assumptions of the law and order ideology and charting out an alternative moral understanding that has widespread mass appeal. This collective ethic should therefore first highlight the moral failings of the prison and the state corporate complex. Second, call for the creation of ethical ways of dealing with the harms, wrongdoing, conflicts, and troubles of all people in society, including those of the state corporate complex. And third, propose the reorganization of society based on the principles of meeting the needs of everyone, so that living in a world without prisons can become a real possibility. Thank you very much.
David, thank you. As you'd expect, there's a lot of questions and comments coming through, and I'm trying to synthesize some of them. And I suppose on the one hand, quickly, because we're going to other speakers, so this is an interim slot for you. In response to Barsha, you know, thinking about, so what do we do? And secondly, choose which one you answer. Is it possible to extract prisons from politics and politics from prisons? And how do we guard against potentially replacing one higher morality with another? Who is the arbiter?
Okay. Well, I mean, we have to remember, just on that second point about the kind of notion of politics, that everything is political. You know, we kind of often try and forget and move beyond this sense of the actual kind of political context in which all decisions are made. We kind of say, oh, I'm apolitical, and so on. So that really isn't kind of a feasible position. Every position that we take has a political context, and therefore the very notion of prisons, and I suppose you're kind of focusing on the political context, which is much more about, I guess, who's sent to prison. Because when we start talking about the politics of imprisonment, it's not so much about what prison does to people, but it's very much about the social backgrounds. And I think that is something which is very, very important. And certainly we cannot get beyond the fact that prisons and punishment have been directed in the main against people from impoverished social backgrounds. That's across its history, and certainly across the last 200 years with the prisons. So there is that kind of political dimension, and prisons have been always very deeply entwined within that broader political nexus. And indeed, the definition of crime and the application of the harms that are actually brought into the criminal process themselves are all profoundly political. So absolutely, we can't extract prisons from the wider political context. It's impossible to do so. What do we do? I mean, I think that's kind of what do we do immediately? Well, we tell the truth about prisons. We have events like this. We try and educate. We try and build that understanding, that consensus about the mass, profound failings of imprisonment, and recognise that we can't, with good conscience, rely upon prisons as a means of actually genuinely engaging with the problems and troubles that we have in society. So I think, I mean, there's many, many ways, and we maybe come back to this in terms of more practical interventions around decarceration or radical alternatives to prison and so on and so forth. There's many, many, many ways that we can actually move forward. But I think the first thing is to have an honest, genuine, open, and deeply engaging discussion about actually what Andrea mentioned about the purposes and the aims of imprisonment. And that's where we start. And then everything else comes from that.
Thank you, David. And like you say, it's part of what this series is all about. I think it's really interesting that Andrea Albert is the chair of the Prison Governors Association, and it was she in her presentation who reminded us, I think the quote was, constant reforms without reform. And the title of today's event is 200 Years of Failure. So we're on it. Our next speaker is going to really help us think through both what that means and what some of the future might look like. Mary, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much to everybody who's attended, organised and participated in this. It's been an absolutely brilliant conversation and dialogue, and one that I hope we'll be able to take forward in the future as well. So my job today really is to talk about the legacies of the 1990 prison uprisings and their aftermath as they applied to the third sector and broader civil society. But in doing so, I want to acknowledge those directly affected by imprisonment and associated harms, and whose ongoing struggles bear witness to the work which is yet to be achieved. I also want to respond to Eric Allison's challenge, which he put down on Monday, regarding the urgency of working together across a seemingly demoralised and fragmented penal reform and abolitionist front at this perilous moment for civil society. So in answer, I want to make a few tentative observations with the usual caveats that there are significant gaps in the research and in the official records, especially with respect to the contribution of the histories from below. So just for information, I'm referring to civil society as that collection of bodies unaffiliated with government and business and for-profits, in which citizens organise to pursue common civic and public goals. But by third sector, I mean groups of activist, advocacy, volunteer and charitable organisations who provide practical support and advocacy and campaigning for civil and welfare purposes, sometimes a combination of both. I also accept that these definitions are problematic and by no means imply a lack of alignment with structural or institutional power. I really want to make 3 points. The first one is that Strangeways presented a critical moment for galvanising security, which didn't translate into hoped for fundamental change, although the recruitment of lay expertise to a raft of new governing and scrutiny bodies from the 1990s onwards permitted some limited participation and influence in implementing some reforms. But there's also evidence that this period mobilised solidaristic and radical activism, which later materialised in second generation organisations, some of which are in existence. And we are, as I'll be saying at the end, also seeing, if you like, a third generation of radical and critical activism, which may point towards the future. Now, civil society and NGOs featured very marginally in the Wolf Report, and their contributions are generally listed under outside bodies in the appendices, while the testimonies of prisoners' families and advocacy groups were admitted as private individuals. But Wolf and Humam acknowledged the public legitimacy deficit arising from the exclusion of external influences, alighting in particular on the prison services' refusal to entertain a proposal of a code of practice, despite, and I quote, considerable common ground as to what should constitute standards, based on the European prison rules and UN standard minimum rules. Now, of course, the stance of the prison service is all the more notable given the modesty of Woolf's recommendations that such a code would initially, and again I quote, not be legally enforceable but would act as a measure of progress, and once achieved, a decision can be made about whether they are to be made legally enforceable. The Board of Visitors, however, who nominally represented independent lay scrutineers, were more summarily dispensed with. And again, I quote, the public and prison service have cause to be indebted to the Board of Visitors. They should lose their adjudicatory powers. Now, of course, banished from this official record then and now were the voices of prisoners and their supporters as self-articulating and self-organising protagonists with programmes of practical demands for redress and protection, a genealogy which stretches at least as far as radical alternatives to prison, RAP, and the preservation of the rights of prisoners, PROP, both active in the 1970s, but with antecedents in the anti-psychiatry, prison abolition and Black consciousness movements of the previous decade. And indeed, contemporary press reports on the scenes at Strangeways reported vigils by supporters and political groups such as anarchists, class war and revolutionary communists. Now, of course, this theme of the delegitimation of activism through its association with political radicalism has subsequently taken more programmatic forms in more recent decades. Now, there is a parallel story, of course, to this, as I said, of the Strangeways perhaps being crystallizing the subsequent emergence of second generation organizations, some of which are still in existence and going very well and strongly: Women in Prison, Inquest, United Friends and Families Campaign and Jengba. So I want that genealogy, of course, to remain rather than being sidelined. Now, secondly, second point I want to make is the apparently democratizing trends of the Blair, Brown and Cameron governments in engaging civil society needs to be offset against the de-democratizing tendencies promoted by governmental partisanship in distributing its patronage and legitimating preferred types of charitable activity while marginalizing critical advocacy and dissent. So at first sight, the Labour government's agenda for adopting the Deakin Report and the future of the voluntary sector and the compact it signed in 1998 with representatives of the third sector was initially celebrated as a long-awaited recognition of the contribution of the third sector to the welfare economy, although it proved very problematic and divisive, and the compact itself certainly didn't speak for all of the sector. Indeed, signatories to the compact were in effect endorsing an emerging political vision of state third sector relations based on recognisably neoliberal governmentalities in two ways. Firstly, through the semantic reframing of social purpose to that of reducing reoffending, deliverable by aligning projects to the goals of offender management and resettlement pathways. Secondly, the incorporation of third sector bodies as a further reserve of service contractors advanced the economisation of the state and social policy. So for many, participation in the so-called mixed penal service market has been detrimental, as gains have certainly not offset losses, although some charities and some large VSOs have benefited. So income inequalities within the sector, already divided between super charities and the rest, has increased. Under contract funding regimes, governance and accountability are reframed around supposedly neutral market transactional terms and obligations. Nuanced and highly developed programs designed with whole person needs are simplified to minimalist and prescriptive outcomes. Terms of contract based on payment by results don't pay for the so-called soft relational tasks, leading to the further extraction of emotional labour value from staff, many of them women. And the requirement to implement a punitive element under certain contracts further facilitates a trend towards unthinking social production within mainstream criminal justice delivery, with unthinking here referencing both the limits placed on reflexive practice and the admissibility of innovative knowledge production in the mainstream criminal justice space. Final point I want to make is that the state reserves a right to qualify and legitimate certain third sector actors and activities and disqualify and delegitimate disfavoured participants, which has been in evidence for decades, is crystallising in starkly neo-feudal forms in recent years. Now, this trend can be traced back to 2012 with a series of campaigns to curb third sector and civil society's right of critical advocacy, promoted by the output of right-wing think tanks such as the Policy Exchange and the Institute of Economic Affairs, whose pejorative characterization of campaigning bodies as sock puppets and mere ciphers for left-wing vested interests prompted legislative proposals in 2016, which threatened to legislate that charities and organisations in receipt of state grants had to sign up to a broad legal condition not to use public money to, and I quote, influence members of parliament, attempt to influence legislation or regulatory action, or press for the renewal of grants. Now, the clause didn't apply to contracts, but my research with Kate Williams and Mike Maguire has evidenced that the use of gagging clauses has become widespread and is exerting a silencing effect, particularly among smaller organisations. Now, this confrontational approach has metastatized in the current wave of visceral culture wars designed to create wedge issues around legitimacy to intervene in public policy and discourse, because that's what it is. It promotes polarization, which deflects from the appalling fallout from a decade of economic crises, accentuated by the current mortality rates and patterns. It drives NGOs by legal threats out of causes such as penal minimalism, corporate transparency, profiteering, cronyism, tax justice, prisoners' rights, and it restores a core concept of social obligation as charity, which is an ultimately private endeavour structured around patronage and philanthropy, and further attempting to funnel moral authority back to the narcissistic autocracy which hold power at the moment. I'm going to wrap up just with 2 points. So to conclude, I'm afraid the relationship between politics and civil society are at their lowest point for decades, certainly lower than in the 1990s. The governing class is entrenched and sustained by de-democratizing forces which are in open conflict with liberal democratic frameworks and norms and operate on an assumption of impunity and immunity. But exhausting and divisive as the current situation is, this de-civilizing project is crystallizing civically courageous pushback, and we have been seeing and are participating in strong collective responses from charities, scientific and medical councils, trade unions, and legal activism. So I think some hope can be vested in the emergence of a new generation of strikingly radical critiques around criminal justice, Black Lives Matter, divestment from penal expansion, but also the renaissance in civil society thought and practice. And I would just probably put before this forum really, maybe one of the questions is how civil society can participate in future repair, how that momentum can be harnessed and practically materialized is another question perhaps for a future forum.
See what you did there, Mary, very clever, thank you. ... to be continued. There are loads and loads and loads of questions rolling in, and there's one that I think is asking if perhaps one of the greatest outcomes of the movement and the activities that you described from the 70s was to push slightly more mainstream organisations into the more radical terrain. And the question that I was thinking of asking you before I saw that was, why is it that any discussion about fair, transparent, proportionate and safe responses to what we call crime and the people we call criminals seen as so extremely radical?
I mean, my short answer, because I don't want to take up more time from the others, but I think my short answer is that civil society as a whole has shifted to the right. It's shifted towards punitiveness, and it's shifted towards, you know, what's generally called kind of neoliberalism, but, you know, neoliberalism where, you know, the dream of kind of unfettered, deregulated, morally autonomous, homo economicus, you know, the intellectually determinist idea that we can be reducible to transactions and to individualized interests and moral choices has hit the buffers. It's hit the buffers, you know, in the extreme. And here's the irony. I mean, the irony is that those people and those groups which have most earnestly stressed that we don't need collective structures, that our socialized approaches towards resolving some of the key economic, social, health and well-being, and indeed our survival problems that are ahead of us, are the very, very, very first to shout, where's the scaffolding, where's the social structure, where's the social state, where's the welfare state, when we're confronted with really, really significant challenges. That's the short answer. I mean, I'll give it more thought, really, maybe for the...
Thank you, Mary. And I think you've given lots of food for thought. Please have a look at the Q&A, because you'll see how many people have responded directly and named some of the interventions from you that they found most helpful. And I think that's given us a lot of traction for moving forward. So without further ado, I am very pleased to welcome Eric Allison back as a speaker. And Eric, when you're ready, you are going to present to us for no more than 10 minutes. And we look forward to hearing what you're going to say. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you to the speakers, in particular, Andre, the prison governor. I didn't come across many decent prison governors in my time. Andre is certainly one. Ironically, Brendan O'Friel was one as well, and we see where it got him. But anyway, there we are. I think it's perhaps worth reflecting now for a short time on what happened after the Strangeways riot. It was followed a year later by the Wolf report. Lord Justice Wolf, he reported on the Strangeways riot and the disturbances that followed, and it was hailed as a blueprint for a decent and humane system. And for a while, it appeared as though we were on the right lines. Cell sanitation was introduced, phones, better visiting facilities. Things seemed to be going along okay. And then we had Michael Howard and Anne Widdecombe. And lest I be accused of political bias, I add to that role of dishonour Jack Straw and David Blunkett, now Baron Blunkett, who introduced the wretched IPP sentences, which are still causing untold harm and suffering to people in prison. And where are we now? We knew before lockdown that the prison system was in a mess. We heard again from Andre about the cuts because there's no votes in prisoners. You know, people don't care about prisoners, and or not many people care about prisoners. I was convinced, or I am convinced, that before lockdown, the prison system was in a far more dangerous and chaotic state than at any time since I've known it. The biggest single problem, in my opinion, of course, is mental health. Again, before lockdown, we saw the rise in self-harm and suicides, and we can only imagine how much that has been made worse now by the lockdown conditions. If people were suffering with mental health issues before lockdown, they're going to be far, far worse now, and that's for sure. And this lockdown, by the way, was driven by the Prison Officers Association. And they're not my words, by the way, they're the words of the National Chair in the summer edition of Gate Lodge, their in-house magazine, where he said there was no going back to how things were before the lockdown. You know, they are running the show, and they know it, and they're quite proud of it. And despite the efforts of decent governors, I repeat, you know, they're running the show. So what can be done? We're not going to see another riot on the scale of Strangeways, for the simple reason that since then, the system has never allowed large numbers of prisoners to congregate together in one place, and certainly not going to happen anytime soon. So I suggest that it falls to us, the reformers who are outside the prison walls. We have to do more than be talking heads. We have to do more than have events like this, which are good. It raises questions, it tells people what's going on, that's fine, but we need to do more. We can't leave it to the prisoners. The men who courageously, in my view, took to the roof, they paid dearly for their transgressions. We can't ask prisoners to do that again. So I think that as individuals and organisations, we've got to come together on a regular basis. We've got to seek out abuses, we've got to call them out, and we've got to demand action. We have to do more, as I say, than be more talking heads. The prisoners have not only been incarcerated during lockdown, they've been silenced. I suggest that we should aim to become their voice on a regular and upscaled basis. And that's it, really. That's what we have to do. It's a big job, and we have to, we have to raise our game. We really do. So thank you very much. I'll be glad to take any questions.
Thank you, Eric. And lots of people have commented on how useful they found your presentations yet again. And there's a couple of questions I want you to respond to if you're willing. One is, you've described a decent governor as a thing. Maybe expand a little. What you mean?
Forgive me.
What are the constituent parts of a decent governor?
I'm sorry, Charlie, could you?
Sure. What are the characteristics that make up a decent governor? How do you know when you've got one?
Well, you know by the state of the prison, and the first thing about a decent governor is that when you walk into a prison, the moment you walk into a prison, and I was in a lot of prisons because I was moved around a lot because I was regarded as a difficult prisoner, and the moment you walked into a prison, you smelt it. You felt, hang on, this is a bad jail, or hang on, this is a good jail. Where it was a good jail, you found that there was a good governor, and they set the tone. A good friend of mine now, John Podmore, he was a good governor. I never served in a prison where he was a governor, but I know he was a good governor. And he said to me that when he got new staff, the first thing he said to them was that if you can't, he said, you're going to meet people who've been locked up for some serious crimes, some awful crimes in some cases. If you can't treat them with decency and humanity, then go and work in Tesco's. Don't work in my prison. And it stems down. And I went to Risley, oddly enough, after Brendan O'Friel had been there, and it used to be called Grizzly Risley. When I walked into Risley, it was a Cat C prison then, it was a decent jail. It was a decent jail, you know. It was the best time or the easiest time that I've ever done. Never had an argument with a prison officer. Never. I think I had one spell in the segregation unit, and it was my fault, you know. So yeah, it stems from a decent governor.
Okay, thank you. And following on from that, there's an idea that there's a series of questions that are about kind of the abolitionist project, and we'll come to them later, but there's another series that are clustered around working within the system. So one is a decent governor, and another one is there's an idea that maybe the listeners scheme and counselling programmes in prison and wider what's called offending behaviour programmes may or may not have a value. What do you think about either of those offers and how useful or antisocial they might be for people in prison?
I think the idea of them is good, obviously. It gets away from the notion that prison is just about containment. You know, you have to find out why people have done what they've done, you know, why they've arrived in the position where they broke the law in the way that they did and they're in prison. But again, it comes down to resources, it comes down to staff. And by the way, and I must add this, on my last prison sentence, I came across more decent prison officers than I'd encountered in the previous 4 or 5 decades. So they do exist. I am not anti-prison officer. I would support higher pay and higher qualifications for prison officers. You know, they shouldn't just be turnkeys, and some of them want to be more than turnkeys.
Eric, thank you. I think we're going to return to some of the issues that you've raised and certainly to some of the questions and comments you've provoked once everybody's spoken. So I'm going to leave you for now.
Okay. And
graciously and gracefully move over to our final speaker, the one and only, Professor Joe Sim. Joe, you're going to speak for 10 minutes and then we'll all come back together. So over to you.
Okay, thank you, Charlie, and thank you for the invitation to speak, and thank you to everybody who's attending. I don't have a camera on my computer, so apologies for that. So it would just be my voice coming from cyberspace. I think over the last week, I think we should be angry and outraged by many of the stories that we've heard, not only in relation to Strangeways, but many other aspects of the criminal justice system. I certainly feel that sense of outrage and the state's abject failure across a whole range of institutions, including prisons, to provide a duty of care to those detained within them. A deadly combination of degradation, punishment, callousness, systemic indifference. I've heard the stories throughout the week has led to the situation that we're in today. And that isn't a situation which has disappeared. Anybody that's read the Chief Inspector of Prisons reports in 2018 from Birmingham, Nottingham, Exeter, Liverpool prison, we see the same story repeated of systemic degradation, humiliation, violence, indifference, racism. They should be ashamed of themselves in so many different ways. So what we have is 200 years of failure from the late 18th century right away through to the late 20th and early 21st century. And how are we then going to deal with that? We've had 200 years of criminal injustice. So the question is, how can we get from systemic criminal injustice to systemic social justice? And the answer to that lies not in endless crisis, reform, but in abolition. Now, of course, if you say you're an abolitionist, then we see the mobilisations of labels in the attempt to discredit those who take that position. And that reflects the abject level of political debate in this country and its glib, mendacious labels that are mobilised against critics. Abolitionists are caricatured as, and offensively caricatured as being pro-crime and anti-victim. But actually, if we look at the state's response to crime, for example, after the banking crisis in 2008, and the way that the bankers were and the crimes of the powerful were systematically ignored, please tell me who's pro-crime there. I mean, the state says to me I'm anti-victim, then we only need to look at the responses to violence against women, to violence against BME groups, to violence against LGBTQ plus people, to realise that actually it's the state who's anti-victim, because those responses have been absolutely abject over the years. And then they'll say, oh, well, you idolise crime and you idolise the criminal. No, we do not in any way, shape or form. And then the argument is, well, what about dangerousness? What do we do about that? Now, nobody here or any abolitionist would deny there's conventionally dangerous individuals who need to be confined. The levels of violence against women in our society bear witness to that. But as Steve Toombs eloquently pointed out yesterday, how do we define dangerousness? How do we measure the 600 deaths that occur each year as a result of murder against the data that Steve's presented, 280,000 deaths at work between 1999 and 2019, 100 custodial sentences. Where's the danger? How do we understand that? And I think if the dead could speak, how would they describe dangerousness? If the dead at Grenfell could speak, who would they say are the dangerous in our society? Not the inner city black kids who are increasingly making up the prison population, but the network of corporate power and the individuals and gangs of them who conspired to fit the building with cladding. And what about Ella Kise Deborah, the 9-year-old girl who died of asthma? How would she define dangerousness in this society? Or indeed, the number of people who die in custody. Tony Payne, who killed himself in Liverpool, wrote to his mother saying, I'm in a bad way. I've been nearly stabbed twice in a week. I've cut my arms. They want to move me unless I grasp. Help me, please. A plea that went ignored. How would Tony define dangerousness? So there's a real issue here about stereotyping abolitionists and constructing abolitionists as individuals who are either pro-crime or anti-victim or who don't consider dangerous. It's a complete reverse. What we need is a discussion and debate in a society about how we define dangerousness and who dies and how those deaths are a result of a whole series of social harms which are generated by those in power in our society and who are completely and utterly shielded by a culture of immunity and impunity. So abolitionists, 21st century abolitionists would completely reject those pejorative, offensive labelling stereotypes mobilised by the state and by others, because at the end of the day, they don't have an answer to the problem of the prison or the criminal justice system more generally. An abolitionist would argue to challenge the hypocrisy of the criminal justice system, to expose social harms and the laser-like way that the criminal justice system focuses on the poor and not the powerful. It would challenge the idea that prisons are full of dangerous psychopaths, when in fact they're warehouses for the poor and those regarded as social junk in our society. They would challenge the idea as well that actually prisons are dangerous places for prison officers, because in actual fact, when you look at the statistics, as myself and David Scott have done, we actually see that the number of days lost for prison officers in terms of health and safety issues such as musculoskeletal problems, sickness, stress, bullying by managers, anxiety and depression far outweigh the number of assaults. It's not to say that assaults don't happen, but it's to get a grip and a handle on the grim reality of life in these places. And they'll say that prisons are awash with drugs. That might be the case, but we also have to concentrate on the fact of those prisoners who die as a result of not getting their drugs and not getting their medication, as Inquest has indicated in the case of Ashley Gill. So, excuse me, abolitionists would challenge those stereotypes and indeed challenge the dominant ideologies that persist about prisons. And we start to talk about a whole range of, as many as know, a whole range of policies, abolitionist alternatives in Angela Davis's phrase. Stop building prisons, start to close them down. Women's prisons would be a good start. Redirect resources, as Black Lives Matter has said. We're spending 16 billion a year on the criminal justice system. Where's it going? Well, I'll tell you where it isn't going. It's not going into public health or housing or jobs or mental health care or education. That's exactly where it should be going. Dismantle the occupational culture of prison officers. 10 weeks training is appalling, actually, when you consider the job that they're doing. But we have to have a training program which includes anti-racism and anti-sexism, anti-homophobia, human rights, social justice, psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. Remove the private sector. Democratise, as Steve Toombs and Patrick Williams talked about yesterday, democratise the criminal justice system, make it accountable, but in a way which is truly democratic. And actually, if the prison service lived up to its own rhetoric, it would be using the Chief Inspector of Prisons recommendations. But what happens, many of them are absolutely ignored. The system doesn't even live up to its own rhetoric. Democratise the judiciary. Access to justice is a right for everybody. And I think in the 21st century, start to develop a practice of safety and protection, which is going to offer genuine protection for and between prisoners and workers and women and BME people and LGBTQ plus people and the homeless. Link this to a duty of care across the society and a duty towards social justice. How should we organise our communities to feel safe? How can we protect individuals who suffer differentially punishment and pain with regard to violence and intimidation and harassment? And what role, if any, does the prison play in that? I would argue at the moment, very, very little. So we need a much wider debate about protection and safety, which links prisoners into all these other groups and all these organisations and all the different groups and organisations that are confronting social injustice, and actually start to think in broader terms about death, the death through poverty, the death through what Chris Grover has termed social murder by destitution, deaths among the homeless, deaths from malnutrition, deaths from lack of heating, deaths due to cuts in benefits. We need a debate which actually places the prison right at the centre of that, in the sense of saying, does the prison protect those groups and individuals from this lack of safety? And at the end of the day, it doesn't, in my opinion. We need to deal with the corrosive impact of masculinity inside and outside prisons. And we should also be defending those institutions, such as the Barlinnie Special Unit, which is now closed, such as Parkhurst Sea Wing, which is now closed, and such as Grendon Underwood, which is on the margins, which does offer some glimpse of the future as an abolitionist alternative. We should be defending them. Two final points I want to make here, folks. One is the issue about COVID. COVID was a chance for the implementation of radical alternatives, and in many other cases, the government failed in that. And it was really depressing. They could have embarked on a radical decarceration program and they failed in that. The second thing is, and it's an issue here for me, defenders of the system will say, well, if we could only restore the cuts that have been made, we can get back to normal. The dominant discourse has been about prisons are in a bad state because of the cuts. But the pre-cuts prison was a place of degradation, humiliation, violence, and death. I've looked at the figures last night. Between January 1978 and December 2010, there was 3,782 deaths in prisons. That was the pre-cuts prison. So the idea that the new norm is going to be the prison pre-COVID and pre-cuts, I think is really problematic. Death, danger and dehumanisation were still part of that system. One final quote I want to finish on, because my time's up, 11 minutes. George Jackson, who was murdered in 1971 by the American state, said this: the ultimate expression of law is not order, it's prisons. We have hundreds upon hundreds of prisons and thousands upon thousands of laws, yet there is no social order, no social peace. It seems to me that those who defend prisons have to explain why in 2021 we have no social order, we have no social peace, and we have no social justice. And if they can't do that, then morally, they should become abolitionists as well. Thanks very much.
Joe, thank you so much, and I hope you get a chance to look through the Q&A and see how you've inspired and kind of galvanised and mobilised so many people in the audience, not just today, but through the week and through the last few decades. So thank you very much indeed. I think you have directly responded to a lot of the questions that have come in. And so I suppose, just as we go to widen the conversation back out and involve the other panellists, I wonder, you put the prison at the centre of that analysis, and it made me think about kind of looking the other way out. And if there's one thing we've learned through this week, or have reinforced perhaps, it's that prison is a manifestation and a kind of symbol of a much broader matrix of circumstances and decisions and ideological habits. So how does abolitionism, the practice or the project, interact with that wider matrix of state design of all care and security functions? Is there a way that abolition works its way out of those existing structures?
You mean in terms of challenging this?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Yeah. I think that a lot of my remarks and my kind of outrage comes also from the fact that I first went into prison in 1975. You know, so I've seen, you know, over these years, seen not many changes, and the Chief Inspector of Prisons reports in 2018 simply reflected what I saw in 1975. So I don't see progress at all in any way, shape or form. And indeed, I think, you know, it's, you know, the whole issue about the occupational culture of staff, that some of the staff I interviewed left the prison service because they were fed up being called care bears, you know, who were trying to do a decent job, but they were fed up and humiliated. So there's all of those issues over the last 30, 40 years. And I do see abolitionism, prison abolitionism, and the arguments that abolitionists put, those arguments can be generated against also the whole, has to be plugged into the role of the state in our society and the role of state institutions in our society. And it raises the profound question, why is that? Why is it that the state incessantly focuses downwards on those on the political and economic margins of our society? But we heard yesterday from Steve and others the massive social harms in our society that are conducted by the powerful. So I actually think at the end of the day, the hypocrisy that surrounds the debate about law and order and crime and punishment in this society has to be called out. I think in every forum we have to say, actually, let's look at the corporate criminals. Let's look at the harms that are being done. Let's look at the asthma deaths. As I said earlier, if the dead could speak, who would they talk about in terms of dangerousness in our society? And that leads finally to the whole question of democratising the state and democratising the state institutions. And we should be able to have that conversation without in any way, shape or form being pejoratively labelled by a whole bunch of people inside the state and outside who frankly don't know what they're talking about.
Thank you, Joe. I was distracted there because I was copying and pasting Bernard's question to all panelists, because I think it's a really helpful way to maybe frame this final 15 minutes. So if all the panelists want to rejoin the audience in the room, thank you. And I wonder if it's a starter for 10, Bernard's kind of generous idea around what if right now a clear political message for a joined up campaign to limit prison numbers, absolutely, and divert the resources to community alternatives that was pragmatic and realistic. A, is that something that we should be focusing on and trying to figure out? And B, if so, what are the component pieces of it? And I guess, Andrea, you haven't spoken for a long time. Do you want to have a go at that?
Yes, I agree with that. We lock up far too many people in prison. I've had the privilege of governing 2 women's prisons as well as male prisons. And I was horrified a few weeks ago when the government announced they're going to build 500 extra women's places. We lock up people who are mentally ill, who have got learning difficulties, non-payment of fines, You know, I could just go on and on and on. And for me, when I said in my my kind of address to the webinar that we need to have a conversation with government about what the purpose of prisons is, my view is, I'm not an abolitionist, this is just my personal view, I'm not, but I absolutely think that prison should be for the most dangerous people who are an absolute risk for society, and then everybody else, the community and society, has to take responsibility.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrea. David, have you got an immediate response?
Yes, thank you. I think that point that Andrea just finished, I think, is an important one. And just so we're aware of the kind of data in terms of the social backgrounds of prisoners and dangerousness, we should note that there's only about 66 people in prison out of the 78,000 that we've talked about earlier, who actually are never going to be released from prison. And the vast majority of people in prison, as Andrea's indicated, are people with significant social problems, mental health problems, substance misuse, have grown up in care. They come from incredibly difficult backgrounds. So I think absolutely what Andrea's saying there in terms of taking what could be called as the attrition model, which is actually looking at particular backgrounds of people who are sent to prison and recognising that they've been more harm to than actually the harm that they've done. And I think that's been an abolitionist strategy going back at least to the 1970s, and calls for that in terms of what's known as selective abolition. And that leads me to the second point, which is this notion that abolitionism is actually a journey. There's a continuum between reform and abolition. It's not as if you're kind of abolitionists kind of who stand out there and don't want to intervene and just throw stones. Abolitionists are very much involved in engaging with the present, and you know, you find that through engaging with the law courts, as Joe and I did just towards about this time last year in a COVID case, engaging with parliamentary committees, speaking in the House of Parliament, putting in submissions to official reports, engaging with shareholder meetings of private prisons, making public speeches, and so on and so forth. Abolitionists have varied different forms of interventions which would align with and actually be very closely associated with many of those of penal reforms. So when it comes to this notion of sending out a message of trying to find a reductionist agenda, then I think absolutely abolitionists would want to be kind of on that pathway. I don't see there's kind of any inconsistency in terms of an abolitionist speaking with others in terms of saying we want to see reduction to 40,000 to 20,000 and less. And although the prison budget itself is only 3.4 billion, and I say only because obviously that's a lot of money, but it's really not sufficient when it comes to the kind of social needs that we have in society. And 3.4 billion is nowhere near enough to meet the points I raised about kind of addressing social need. And that has to be a kind of a completely flipping of the kind of current agenda from a punitiveness to one which actually is based in social welfare, health and needs of others. And that needs to be outside of the punitive rhetoric of the law and order society. And I think the other kind of context to this, of course, again, brings us back to COVID, in which there was an opportunity for there to be a really radical reduction of the prison population this time last year. And as kind of Andrea mentioned in her talk at the very top, the prison population in February last year was about 83,000. It's now about 78,000. There's been a drop of about 5,000, depending on exactly which marker you look. I think it was maybe a fraction higher in January than it was in February. But it could have been much more. And actually, I think all of us would be kind of trying to persuade and argue and say, look, let's reduce the prison population as much as we can. But the point that Joe kind of pointed to just in his conversation a few minutes ago, you can't have that major change with the prisons unless you also invest in the community and address all the different social injustices, whether it be racialized, gendered, or other kind of forms of injustice that characterize society. And we must look outwards, and we must, as I mentioned earlier, look at that higher immorality of the powerful and the corporations and the states. And that is where the most dangers and threats come from in our society and in societies all around the world. And really that is kind of the issue that we must be looking beyond the prison.
She gets a chance to speak.
Yeah, thank you.
That because I know she's got to leave us briefly. So Mary, have you got any final thoughts?
David, I hate to cut through, but Yeah, I do actually. I think now is the time for utopian thinking, you know, and utopian, it doesn't mean pie in the sky. Utopian means the best of aspirations materialized in what's possible at a given time. Our post-war generations rebuilt a utopia. Utopia doesn't mean heavenly perfection. It means what can be practically realized with the resources available towards building a better future. And quite frankly, I think that the basic scaffolding is there. You know, our social frameworks have not entirely been hollowed out, and we've been on a back foot in many senses trying to protect and preserve those, but they could form the basis. The second thing is the capacity and capability is there. I mean, there's a creative genius across civil society, across our public services. There are grounds for commonality and for working with a coalition of those for whom repair and rebuild means social justice, economic justice, welfare justice, and criminal justice. There are also a number, I think, and I was talking earlier about, there is a revival now of a wave of new, very practical programs animated by a commitment to repairing our economy, tax justice, social justice, local economic justice, the rebuilding of communities. These are being practically realised largely at local and municipal level. The central state is an enormous problem. There is a paucity of imagination, a breathtaking paucity of imagination, which goes back decades as to how government can work with communities, localities, and with civil society. And it's become exhausted. It's frankly become exhausted. And I really welcome the fact that so many, somebody mentioned Kate Paradine, so many leaders of the sectors, and indeed so many public sector people are coming forward and literally just saying, look, time is out on the market society economy. Time is out on it. We're at a point of where retrenchment, where going back is snagged at the moment. I'm not confident that this particular government will respond. I think in many senses we have to take the rebuilding from the grassroots. What could we do? We need to think fundamentally about repair and relationships, a reparative principle, not just moral, as David said, not just political, not just, it's a practical dimension. These utopian ideals drive the actual design and purpose of our social institutions, okay? There's a whole load of things I could say about what could we do now? A code of practice across NGOs and activisms do no harm. This will particularly, I think, impact on the kinds of difficulties that so many organizations that contracted with the state over the past 20 years got into. And by the way, I am not pointing the finger at the voluntary sector by any means. I think some of the smartest, most humane and most creative people work in that sector. And they also, I think, have striven to resolve many of the contradictory strands that they've had to balance. But I think time is up, and I'm amazed at the number of charitable leaders who are now coming out and literally saying, we need to redirect the creative energy, the political will, and actually the real desire for change. And if that sounds utopian, that's good. It's why I'm an abolitionist.
Thank you, Mary. Inspiring and practical as ever. Eric, last final thoughts and reflections from you.
Andrea spoke about women's prisons, and nowhere have I felt the futility of prisons, if you like, you know, more than in women's prisons. I'll give you a couple of brief examples. I spoke to a group of women in style prison a few years ago, and I think there were about 15 in the room, and I asked them who had not self-harmed, and there was one lady who raised her hand who had not self-harmed. And I've never met a woman in prison who wasn't in one way or another a victim. And then another time I went into Holloway while I've had this job, and I asked to see the segregation unit, and there was only one lady in the segregation unit. And I asked if I could speak to her, and they said she was dangerous and not to put my face too near the hatch. And I had a conversation with her, and I asked her how she was being treated. And she said, I'm being raped and tortured on a daily basis. And then I carried on talking, and then a couple of minutes later, I asked the same question again. And her words, absolute verbatim there, imprinted on my mind. She said, oh, they're lovely people. We're having jerk chicken for lunch today. Can I come out and play afterwards? And I just thought, what on earth is this woman doing in a segregation unit in a prison? And that, to me, encapsulated the futility of prison in ways that, I don't know, it just absolutely moved me. We have to get away. We have to get away. And again, I go with Andrea, agreeing with the prison governor again, you know. We must only lock up the people who are dangerous. We must stop locking up the people who are nuisances. You know, they're not, you know, prisons aren't the dangerous places that people imagine. You know, I've seen some, yes, of course I've seen violence in prison, but I've also seen great acts of kindness and humanity. You know, we just need to reduce the population and then work with the small number of people that we've got to help and prevent reoffending in the future. We've got to do something. We can't allow this to carry on.
Thank you, Eric. I think you've summed the whole series of events up really well, and there does seem to be a sense of a lack of coherence and coalition, and I wonder if what we're starting or continuing to create between us is something around that very movement. And I think everyone in our audience, I'm sure, would join me in saying I certainly could listen to each of you for a lot longer. I know you will be able to see the amount of unanswered questions and unresponded to comments in the Q&A box. We could go on for hours. Each of you has brought challenge and new insights, I think, to us. And I just want to, in the last minute and a half, feed back some of what I've heard, not only from today, but over the week. Obviously, it has a certain filter, and that is Chair's prerogative, but it was a disaster. Organised gangs, 200 years of failure, constant reform without reform. They should be ashamed of themselves. A culture of immunity and impunity, racist, violent, harmful, corrupt, secretive, dangerous. None of that emotive, descriptive language was directed at people in prison. All of that emotive, descriptive language was actually used in discussion about the systems and the structures that house and detain people in prison. Jo has left us, I think, Mary has left us with this idea of local and municipal rebuilding, the genius of the creativity throughout civil society. That's all of us. And I think Jo's idea of democratising democracy has left us really with both a challenge and a kind of motivation. And I know that the centre has every intention of not leaving all these questions and comments unanswered in a Q&A box, but of continuing to build on the momentum and this movement and coalition that we've started to see come together. How useful, complex, often dichotomous conversation can be. Putting people who disagree or who expect to disagree maybe together in conversation actually produces stunning results, and we will be following that up. So to each of you that's been involved in whichever way, thank you very much. Videos will start to come out from today and over the course of the next week. It's been an absolute honour and pleasure. Thanks to each and every person who's taken part in all the different ways. To Jo for being the not brainchild, but having this original idea, and for everyone who supported the organisation. And we will be in touch. Thank you very much indeed.